Welcome to In Depth for a look at what is making mining headlines in the Americas. Governments around the world are looking at ways to get more benefit from high commodity prices, including by raising taxes and royalties for the mining industry. Mining Week's Deputy Editor for North America, based in Toronto, Lizzo Hill, joins me to discuss the issue. Welcome to the show, Lizzo.
Hi, Martin.
We have seen a few instances of tax increases. Are there more on the way?
Yes, I think it's a combination of factors coming together in various forms. Obviously, as you mentioned, the commodity prices are in many cases at historically high levels, which means that the mining companies are generating increased levels of revenue, and that's something that I think obviously the local governments are aware of where the prices are moving, and they see the companies reporting on a quarterly basis how much money they're making, profits, revenue, and so on. And so there is a push then to see more of the benefits coming to the country themselves where the mines are located. A lot of countries are still rebuilding their finances, getting things back together after the economic downturn and the financial crisis, so that also comes into play. And then, of course, most of, as you know, a lot of the countries that are rich have these mineral wealth that the foreign investors are coming in and looking to develop. Those countries very often are, in almost every other way, extremely poor. And so then there's this pressure to see more of the benefits spread out to more of the population. And so that can often also be then leads to pressure to increase the taxes, royalties, and just to push for more benefits from the mining industry to local communities and to the governments. Another thing, there are specific cases. For example, Chile, they introduced actually a voluntary royalty on the mining industry, although all the companies then agreed to participate, and that was a specific case. The money is destined for the reconstruction and rebuilding of the country after the earthquake that they had. And then another thing, just finally, is changing governments in these local countries where the projects and the mines are located. Is that often, and again coming back to that pressure to see the poorer people and the communities benefit from the mining industry, is that often becomes an election issue. And so once these new governments are elected, then they're under pressure to follow through on the promises that they made. And so then that can translate into reviews of mining codes, contracts, and that sort of thing.
And what can companies do to protect themselves?
Yeah, well, I should probably just backtrack a little bit. Obviously, there's two separate things that we're talking about here that the government can look at if it wants to squeeze a little bit more out of the industry. The first is what's often called the mining code or the mining law, and that's the broader legislation, obviously, that covers the mining industry. So it would then include things like the taxes, the royalties, and so on. And so often, especially when there is a new government coming in, sometimes, especially we've seen in Africa and elsewhere in the world, maybe the previous government was a little more autocratic, possibly maybe not even recognized by the international community. And then you get a new democratically elected government, sometimes elected on the basis of promises of getting more benefit from the mining industry. And so then they come in and then they'll do a review of the mineral laws and the mining code and so on, and that's where they can sometimes we can see that increased taxes, super taxes, higher royalties, and so on being announced. One example, example, we've seen in Guinea, the new president Alpha Conde has basically done just that, come in and started a review of the mining code. Then the second thing that governments can look at and do look at is the actual specific contracts or investment agreements that are signed with the companies themselves and for specific operations usually. So often the mining contract would then be between the company and a state-owned entity, a government, a mining company that would that often gets a sort of a minority percentage. Often, according to the law, it's a free carried interest, so they don't have to spend, they don't have to pay their way when it comes to building the project. And that contract would then be between the government-owned entity and the foreign mining investor. And so, again, often in the change of government, the government will then announce that they want to relook at, it could be a broad review of mining contracts, sometimes specific ones that have been identified as maybe problematic. Often the argument is, it was signed with the previous government, either that government, there was corruption involved, or simply that the contract isn't fair to the country and has too much benefit on the side of the foreign investor, the international mining company. And so those are the two things that they look at. Obviously, it's not too much that companies can do aside from lobbying and sort of just making their voice heard and threatening to pull out of the country, I suppose, when governments announce changes to the broader legislation or mining code. But just interestingly, I was listening to a seminar, a couple of lawyers and risk consultants were talking about this exact issue, how mining companies can protect themselves. And when it comes to the contracts themselves, historically there's been a sort of the approach of the mining companies has been to just squeeze the government for as much as they possibly can when they're negotiating these things, and extract as many concessions out of them, sort of waive your financial strength and the investment potential at the government to get as much as you can out of them. And at the end of the day, while that that's fine, that looks good on paper, looks good for your investors, 2-3 years later, that government's overthrown, voted out, and then you've got a whole new set of people sitting in the government who then look at this contract and say, well, that's not fair at all. Maybe allege corruption on the part of the previous government, and then you're back where you started, having your contract renegotiated, and who knows where that is along the process of investing in the project. So basically, what they're saying is, there is a line that you have to walk. You don't have to give them everything, but come at it from an approach of negotiating this contract to benefit the local communities, to benefit the local country, and negotiate it for the long term, that it will withstand a change in government, it will withstand a change of political thinking in the local country. And that probably is the best way the companies can protect themselves from this sort of thing.
What about the stability agreements that are already in place? Will that mean those companies are safe from potential changes?
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, it is difficult because I'm sure, there will be companies and executives who've had these experiences and say, well, there is nothing that we can do. It's all very well to make these arguments about benefits to local communities, but sometimes, greed is greed. And there simply wasn't anything that we could have done that would have been satisfied our investors and as well as the local government. But the stability agreements are an interesting question. When we see announcements made by governments, or there's some leaked reports that a specific government is planning to introduce a super tax, windfall tax, increased royalties, or what have you, immediately all the press releases come out from the mining companies saying, well, we've got a stability agreement in place with this government. They've agreed not to change our taxes for X amount of years. And that's that. Obviously they're not talking about us. There must be other mining companies out there that, that this tax will be applied to. And in certain cases, that is true. That turns out that, the government was talking about future projects, new investments, and they weren't planning to change the ones that are already in production. They do have these agreements. But then, of course, coming back to that old problem of the change in government, that, there are cases where the government can argue, well, this agreement was signed with a previous government, maybe a government that, was corrupt. The stability agreement was illegal because it's imposing these, those terms on the future governments. And so, it's sort of case by case. that companies need to be very careful, I think, in their relationship with the governments and just understanding where they're investing.
Thank you, Lizo, for your time. That's the show for today. Join us again next week for more news and insight on the Americas. I'm Martin Joaquino for Creamer Media in Johannesburg.